Cortisol and norepinephrine are two of the hormones that are released into our body when we experience a traumatic event or go through a critical incident. Here are some of the effects you can expect on your body from chronic exposure to norepinephrine: hypertension, heart damage, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, organ ischemia and necrosis, plasma volume depletion, DNA damage and increased cancer risk, hyperarousal, exasperated anxiety and mood disorders, cognitive deficits, Alzheimer's, metabolic disorders, gastrointestinal issues, suppressed immune function. Now let's talk about the effects repeated exposure to cortisol will have on your body. Metabolic changes, cardiovascular strain, weakened immune system, musculoskeletal issues, digestive problems, skin problems, mood and emotional regulation, memory and cognitive function, fatigue and sleep disturbances, hormonal imbalances. Okay, so the main point of this video is I want you to think about all that just for a second. If you remember in one of my first videos, I talked about how the average American will experience 2 to 4 critical incidents or traumatic events in their lifetime, right? But the average first responder, one study said 178, the other said 600, depending on how busy of a call volume you have. But if we use that smallest number of 178, that is still a 9,000% increase compared to an average citizen. So we are experiencing 9,000% increase of exposure just from the critical incidents that we go through. A 9,000% increase of exposure to cortisol and norepinephrine. Think about that for a second. If we now just listed all the effects that will have on our body, and then combine that with the stress of everyday life, like we're not only receiving cortisol dumps from critical incidents, we still have the average stress that everybody else has, right? We have families, we have financial issues, you may have issues with coworkers. So we're also getting cortisol elsewhere, but think about the effects that's having on your body and our brain. So sit there now and tell me you're fine. Sit there now and tell me you're okay and you're not experiencing any issues from the things you've seen at work. Best case scenario, you feel fine mentally, but you're still experiencing damage on the inside. The bottom line is our culture needs to change, and administrations need to take action in helping mitigate the long-term effects that these are having on us. And if you think I'm exaggerating, if you think I'm full of it, do your own research, look up the effects that cortisol has on your body, and then sit there with a straight face and tell me you experiencing a 9,000% increase compared to your neighbor isn't going to have a heavy toll on you, that you're not going to pay a heavy price at the end of your career for it, if not sooner. So how does all this work? Well, this initial surge of hormones is triggered by the amygdala, the brain's danger detector. The hypothalamus, which is the brain's command center, then activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Cortisol and adrenaline are then pumped into the body. Our fight or flight responses are driven by adrenaline and norepinephrine. They cause an immediate increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and energy, enhancing alertness to face the perceived danger. Cortisol is often known as the primary stress hormone. Cortisol increases the amount of sugar, glucose, in the bloodstream for energy. While this is crucial for short-term response, chronic elevation of cortisol can have a negative long-term effect on the brain, particularly on memory function in the hippocampus. In some cases of extreme stress, high levels of cortisol can also cause the body to freeze or shut down. So before we move on, let's recap on what I talked about last episode, specifically what goes on in the brain when we experience a traumatic event or a stressful situation, wherever you want to call it, traumatic event, it doesn't matter. When we go through these experiences, the amygdala becomes overactivated and is highly sensitive to threats. The prefrontal cortex, which handles high-level functions like rational thought and executive control, can become underactivated or even shut down. Then we have the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory processing. This can be damaged by prolonged exposure to high levels of stress hormones, and this can lead to problems with memory, including flashbacks, where a traumatic memory feels like it's happening in the present. So what does repeated exposure to stress hormones do to the brain? Well, with the amygdala, the brain's fear and emotional processing center becomes overactivated and highly sensitive. In the long term, this hyperactivity can persist, leaving the brain in a state of constant high alert, even when no threat is present. This can lead to a heightened fear response, making it difficult for you to understand the difference between real threats and perceived ones. In some cases with chronic stress, it causes dendritic growth of the neurons in the amygdala to increase. So what does that mean? I had to look that up. It potentially makes a person more sensitive to stressors. Then we have the hippocampus part of our brain, and that is crucial for learning memory formation. as well as regulating the stress response. The problem is it's highly susceptible to damage from prolonged exposure to cortisol. Some of the damages include shrinkage. Chronic stress can lead to the reduction of the hippocampal volume and dendritic atrophy, which once again is the loss of connections between the neurons. It can lead to memory impairment. The damage to the hippocampus can lead to memory deficits, contributing to the experiences of flashbacks, where a past traumatic event feels like it's happening in the present moment. Chronic stress can suppress the creation of new neurons in the hippocampus. This is a process known as neurogenesis, which can also impair memory. Next, we have the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for higher levels of functioning, basically has executive control over rational thought and emotional regulation. During these experiences, the primitive fight, flight, or freeze response can override the prefrontal cortex. And chronic stress from these repeated critical incidences or traumatic events can cause the functional suppression to become long-term. Some of these problems include reduced function. Chronic stress can reduce the prefrontal cortex's activity, making it harder to concentrate, control impulsive behavior, and regulate emotions effectively. It can also lead to brain fog and difficulty with decision-making and problem-solving skills. Chronic exposure to cortisol will also potentially cause structural changes. Some studies indicate that chronic stress can reduce gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex itself. The Bible verse I'm going to end today's episode with is Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Thank you, and God bless.